Okay, so welcome back from the break. I'm going to move on to presentation number 3. So I'm delighted to introduce Dave Allen, who is Chief Technical Officer and Managing Director of Cesium. This is where you get to hear what your colleagues have written for your bio, Dave. So Dave's expertise has been developed over 20 years in specialist military and secure government roles, and most recently in the private sector. He's passionate about reducing the complexity around cyber security and helping clients understand what they need to know and to do to build resilience in the digital age. So I'd like to invite you to come up. Thank you,
Dave. Just two very quick warnings. My son selfishly decided to be born 2 weeks ago, so I'm still at the sort of matchsticks in eyes phase. And I'm incredibly northern, so if you don't understand anything, then please put your hand up and ask me to repeat it. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, and thank you for hosting me today. What I want to talk about is a bit of a follow-on from the previous 2 presentations. Really, it's just to help you understand what practically you can do as an organisation to make yourself more resilient to cyber attacks. So what I normally do is waffle on about how easy it is to break into somewhere or how easy it is to socially engineer an individual. I'm not going to bother with that. I think my industry's done that enough. What I'd like to talk about is what you can do to make yourself more secure. So a bit about us. We started off as a consultancy firm, and over the last 12 months we took a bit of investment last year, and we've moved into our MSSP sort of growth phase. So UK 24/7 SOC, but still providing the real technical consultancy, which is at the heart of our business. We're first and foremost a technical organisation. So today, a brief intro of the sort of the threat landscape, which I think you all know anyway, but I'll just go over it again. Attack data. What I said before, I normally waffle on about different threats. But because of the organisations in the room, I thought I'd look at something a bit differently. I thought I'd look at the scale of data that needs to be filtered through and understood to be able to actually identify an attack. A few case studies from some of the incident response, emergency incident response engagements I've been on over the last few years, and then a bit of practical advice and where to focus. So this you all know. The attackers, whenever there's a new state level capability, whenever we see a new bit of malware released into the wild, whenever a security researcher picks up, Russian APT28 use this malware and use this techniques, you can bet your bottom dollar that will then filter down to criminal gangs, and they will start to use those techniques. Sometimes it works the other way. So early in the year, we saw the Exchange server vulnerability. And we very quickly saw Chinese state threats and Russian state threats exploiting that vulnerability to gain initial access in organizations. So to meet that sophistication, to meet that sort of trying to fight state level capability in the hands of non-state actors, we need an increased level of capability to identify and defend against that threat. So that means the solutions become much more complex and much more difficult to identify what you need to buy, what you need to do, how you need to structure your organization to identify and defend against these threats. When you couple that with a skills shortage, people are very hard to come across. We see quite a lot of financial services companies who they built their UK-based 24/7 security operations organization in-house, but they can't recruit and retain the staff quickly enough. So they're going towards a more outsourced model. And we see that quite heavily in my own organisation. We've been lucky that we've not really had too many problems with recruiting people, but it's still harder than what it should be. And then the cost of individuals are quite high as well. Also budgets, especially in the current sort of climate and over the last few years, security has been, I wouldn't say deprioritized, but there's much more scrutiny over where you're putting your pounds when it comes down to buying services. So that's the landscape. That's where we are. So Matthew was talking before about attacks, and about 40% of organisations have suffered an attack. So I set this up last year when Liverpool were playing Barcelona, and I knew it was going to be a bad match. So this is a honeypot. So what this is an intelligence collection platform that I put on the internet. So essentially, I set up a computer on the internet in Amazon Web Services and exposed every port to the internet and left it there for 12 hours. So this is after 2 hours of my machine being on the internet. So within 2 hours, there's over 400 attacks. Now, the honey trap attacks and cowrie, and I can't remember which round they go, but one of them is around brute force. So that's people just trying passwords into a username and password field. One of them is around, well, you see the port on there, it's trying to exploit FTP. One is around SSH, file transfer protocol and secure shell. So trying to break into those ports. And there's some other bits and some other types of attacks. But the interesting thing is it's all automated. There's no one sat there with a hoodie on with green covering down their screen trying to break into that system. This is just what happens when you're on the internet. So that's 2 hours. 12 hours, rockets up. And this is, again, one machine. So when we talk about data, when we talk about security operations and how much effort you've got to put into identifying where these attacks have come from, the effort's huge. If we look down here, we can see, Ireland is one of the main attackers. And is that because Ireland have got a particular beef with me and my server, or is it because a lot of the European infrastructure around AWS and other infrastructure suppliers is held with Ireland? So the other point to know is that known attacker, the IP reputation. This is all known, but this is all known stuff. These are all readily identifiable IP addresses, and they're all marked as malicious on the big tier one IT service providers, ISPs. So what this says to me is most of the stuff on the internet, most of the bad things that happen to organizations, or most of the attacks, most of the noise that's generated is automated. And there's a few tools out there. There's a tool called Autosploit, and that combines something called Nmap, which is a network scanning network assessment tool, with Metasploit, which is a penetration testing framework. It's got lots of exploits in there, and Shodan, which is like a search engine for things connected on the internet. And what this tool does essentially says, you press go and it'll say, right, show me all webcams on the internet. Of those webcams, show me this flavor, webcam XP5. Of that webcam XP5, look for a vulnerability. Well, there's a vulnerability around a SAM file for that particular webcam. And dump the SAM file, which should give me the username and password, at least the encrypted version. And that can be done through one person sat in one room, click and go, can scan the internet and can exploit thousands of webcams, just by pressing the button. So when we talk about organizations being under attack, most of it is this. Most of it is this noise. But doing basic things like cyber essentials, again, championing you here, Matthew, but doing basic things like cyber essentials gets rid of most of this, gets rid of most of the noise, and allows your organization to focus on the significant stuff. But this isn't the problem for organizations. This is the problem for countries. So for the UK, so this is my machine. Hundreds of thousands of events within 24 hours. Can you imagine scaling that up to an organization with as many firewalls as Matthew's got? The data being generated is massive. So things like Splunk are really good at ingesting all that data, normalizing all that data, transforming it into something that we as humans can analyze, understand, and investigate. But when you start to scale that up, when you look at the NCSC's job in the UK, you think they've got to look across the whole of the UK. They've got to look across all the internet traffic to try and find that one IP address that might belong to that one adversary. Then you go to on the right-hand side where we look at how do we protect the UK internationally? How do we understand where that attack's come from in the first place? How do we know it was Russia? How do we know it was China? How do we know it was Iran? And that's where the intelligence services really come into their own. And that's where partnerships with friends, the US, Australia, really come into their own too. So why we're talking about all this sort of stuff? Don't worry about attribution. That's the sort of summary of all this. It doesn't really matter who did it. It only matters who did it if it's going to give you information that helps you protect yourself in the future. So it might be important that you say, actually, this was whatever spider group has been, so Cobalt Spider. If this was Cobalt Spider group, or we think it was Cobalt Spider group. Now that's important because we can look at a threat intelligence report that tells us how they conduct their activities. So we can now use that to identify within my organization, on my network, have I got similar vulnerabilities? Am I using these systems that these guys prefer to exploit? But really, but that's it. We quite often get clients say to me, I want to know who did it. Can you trace the IP addresses? Well, yes, but only as far as Belarus, and then it's anyone's guess. And we quite often see good, sophisticated criminal gangs. They will attack organizations that are vulnerable and use them for infrastructure. So the florist on the high street might say, well, I've got nothing to steal. Well, actually, you've got computers, you've got IP addresses, you've got things that obfuscate the origin of a criminal gang or a criminal attacker. So attribution isn't important because it's so expensive to try and get through all those barriers of obfuscation that a criminal or something else will implement. So a few case studies that just highlight the importance of data, I think. The top one, this was a business email compromise. It's almost like we had the conversation before, isn't it? Definitely didn't. So a business email compromise, and what happened was someone had hacked into the project manager's email account and been sat there for about 6 months. During that 6 months, they were learning how they structured their sentences, how they responded to emails, how they conducted their sort of interactions with people. And then on the day that a very large amount of money was supposed to be transferred from the local authority to another organisation that was going to spend it on a technology department for a school, the person who'd hacked the account sent an email to the person on the desk in the local authority and said, "Oh, excuse me, sorry, made a mistake. Can it go to this address, this account?" Within 5 minutes, the money was laundered through another Bulgarian email bank. It was gone forever. And when we were called into the investigation, we found lots of things that were quite surprising to us, being for the government agency. Number one, they'd outsourced their IT and assumed that they were doing security. The IT provider, well, no, we do IT, we don't do security. There's a difference. There was no logging in place because the IT provider hadn't been asked to provide any logging. So when it come down to us being able to do the investigation, there was nothing there to investigate. By the time we got there, they turned all the machines on and off again. So there was no random access memory. There's no volatile memory for us to look at. So there was no data for us at all to do any investigation. There was no two-factor authentication on a key account. The single thing that would have stopped this attack in the very first place. Just a simple thing, a bit of a pain. Is it a pain just to click a button? I don't think it is when you look at the consequences. And no verification on detail changes. It's just a straightforward process. Not even a technical problem. It's a process thing. Second case study, we were asked to do a compromise assessment of a large conference centre in the UK. So we couldn't really find any evidence of compromise internally. There's a few anomalies, but nothing significant. So then they asked us if we could actually just do a bit of an assessment while we were there. So not really a penetration test, but normally, but just can you just have a quick look? So we sat outside, did a quick scan. We found the CCTV system. We managed to navigate to the splash page, the CCTV logon. They were using some cheap Chinese CCTV systems. A bit of research online helped us find a default username and password for that CCTV system. Got into the CCTV system, and then we could scan around the internal network that was it connected all the building management system together. So we had the CCTV system, but that was connected to the security doors, which had a biometric on them. So we could bypass all the biometrics. We could open and close all the blinds, which was fun. But the key thing was this was entirely separate to IT. The organisation hadn't looked at security across the organisation. They looked at it in terms of, oh, that's IT there, you worry about that bit. Everything else is down to building facilities management. We didn't have the expertise to be able to unpick some of this sort of stuff. In the end, myself and my colleague Rick were escorted out of the boardroom when they started fighting. But what it boiled down to was the CCTV system, the value of the contract was £3,000, so it didn't meet the risk threshold to be discussed at the board. And what we were trying to get across was that it's not about the value, it's about the access. And what does that supplier have access to in your organisation? So default credentials, a really straightforward one. Supplier management, they weren't doing risk management properly across the organisation, and they connected loads of legacy systems together because it was easy without thinking about the consequences. The final one was 24/7 GP service. On a Friday, it's always on a Friday, as Keith said before. And by the time we got there, the whole organisation was completely ransomware. The network was completely flat. So once they got onto one machine, the rest wildfire going through the rest of the network. All their backups were in the cloud, which was great. They had backups. The problem was trying to restore from those backups. It took a long time. It took weeks and weeks and weeks to get all that data back. And all they had was antivirus as a protection. And the antivirus they had didn't spot the malware, because not all antiviruses are created equally. The way that we had to help them was we found one laptop that hadn't been ransomwared. We managed to find the first stage dropper and the malware on that laptop, and then we essentially just scanned the malware with lots of different types of antivirus until we found one that worked. Built a sheep dip, and then just slowly, literally machine by machine, built it, sheep dipped, joined the network. A long time, so much effort. They could have done some really basic things up front to protect themselves against that sort of thing. So again, the flat network, making sure that you've got a level of compartmentalization across your network. So if something does go, you're not ruining your whole business. They have to move all their 24/7 GP servers to another organisation for about 3 or 4 days over the weekend, which luckily we think was their quietest time. But anyway, so a few little stories. So what can you do about it? First of all, the NCSC has got some fantastic guidance. Before you go anywhere else, if you go to the NCSC, look at the 10 steps, and they'll talk about all the basic things you need to do to be able to protect your organisation, and that gets rid of 90% of the threat. If you do that and look at something like Cyber Essentials, with Cyber Essentials, you get some sort of insurance free with Cyber Essentials when you get accredited. I'm not sure what it is or how useful it is, but that's a good first step if you have nothing at all. What we ask our clients to do is think about security in a certain way. So we see security as an organizational responsibility. It's not a technology responsibility. Technology is part of the solution, also part of the problem, but technology is part of the solution. Really, it starts right at the very top. It starts the governance of the organization. Who's in charge? Who's accountable for security on a board level? And then we work right the way through those 7 areas. Supply chain is pretty much all that's again, and as much as you can get away with your suppliers. Every incident we've been to, they've all had a supply chain element to the compromise. It's all been a firewall that wasn't patched, an RDP server that was exposed on the internet, someone bringing in a USB stick from a HVAC supplier when they were updating some software on the HVAC server. It's all been the same sort of theme. Organization looking really good, and they've let the guard down with the supplier, exactly like the previous example with the CCTV system. The next thing we do is we try and engineer our clients to put themselves into one of these boxes, and I'd encourage everyone to do the same sort of thing. So we talked before about penetration testing. A penetration test of an organization is next to useless if you're down here. If you don't know what your organization looks like, if you don't have a network map, you don't understand the basic assets you've got in your organization, if you don't understand where you're vulnerable or where you're secure, if you get a penetration test, all that's going to tell you is you're vulnerable in a very narrow area. The penetration tester won't have the time to look at your whole organization. They might be able to do a vulnerability scan, but they won't be able to test it methodically. So the best thing to do around here, which we'll come on to in a second, is some sort of baseline understanding, some sort of assessment that gives you a baseline understanding of where your organization is, and allows you to get to a point where you know you're not secure, but at least you know where the holes are, at least you know where you're vulnerable. And this, in my opinion, is the best place to be. You're never 100%, I don't think. And exactly as Matthew said before, insurance is there for a reason. You can never be 100% sure that you're secure. So being able to work in this quadrant and get as close to this area as you can is where you should be. And if you do think you're secure, if you are really confident, then go for a penetration test, go for a red team, get somebody external to prove to you that your organization is secure. And if it's not secure, that's fine. Move back to this area and start again. But it should be a cycle. It should be constantly reevaluating what your security looks like. This bit in the bottom right is where we see clients who they buy a system and they're not really sure about it. So they go and buy dark trace, they go and buy some big flashy system with flashing red lights and stuff like that. Install it all, you haven't got a clue, whether it's working or not. So some sort of efficiency test about whether that system is doing its job or not gives them the confidence that they're either secure or the system needs to be tuned. So in terms of strategically, in terms of what that approach looks like practically, is we start off with prepare, and the preparation phase really is about instant response. What are you going to do if you get hacked? Now that might be a little post-it note that's stuck on your phone that says phone Keith. If something goes wrong, give Keith a ring, and we'll go from there. It might be phone your insurer, but whatever it is, have something in writing that says to your organisation, if when something bad happens, this is what we're going to do. And then that post-it note can mature over time into a proper business continuity plan that integrates your instant response plan, that looks at all the other aspects of your business, but at least have something on day one that's at least a phone number. The next phase is around identification of your baseline posture. So that might be using some sort of framework, whether it be 27001, whether it be NIST, whether it be whatever else is out there. But it doesn't mean you've got to go for the accreditation, but it just gives you a handrail and gives you a benchmark you can constantly evaluate yourself against. Once you understand that, once you're confident you're not secure, once you know where all those gaps are, then you can start to implement some of the things you need to do to harden your organization and make it more secure. Once you've started with that process and that project or whatever you call it, the implementation of your section, then look at detection. Then look at how you're going to monitor your organization. Where are you going to get your logs from? Are you going to get somebody externally? Are you going to give it to your IT team? What system are you going to use to monitor your organization? The better you do this bit, the easier that bit's going to be. If you try and do this too early, there's loads of noise, loads of data, and you don't really know what to do with it. So make sure you've got some level of understanding of what your organization looks like before you try and detect bad things on your network. And then finally is about assurance, and that's where penetration testing comes in. So I wouldn't bother with a penetration test. I wouldn't sell a penetration test unless an organization has got to a decent level of maturity for their organization. This is what a good ecosystem of capability looks like. So this excludes lots of stuff. This doesn't include identity and access management. It doesn't include all the things that are sort of where IT and security blend a bit. This is just the key capabilities. So lots of data to collect, some sort of security operations function. For a bigger organization, it might be this. For a smaller organization, it might be an individual. But some sort of security operations function that is able to make use of all this data, internal or external. And then the things that help the organization translate all that information into something that helps the organization become more secure. So security assurance, penetration testing, or red teaming, or whatever you want to call it, or vulnerability management, incident response and threat hunting, having at least understanding who's going to be responsible for being able to respond to an incident when it does happen, who's got the expertise in the organization. Governance, risk, and compliance. So that is making sure that you build an information security management system or a function, or making sure that you're putting the right policies and procedures in place that give your organization the best chance of developing a rigorous security program around your organization. And then finally, security engineering. So taking all the information, like Keith talked about before, all that attack data, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to tune your organization to make sure that data is going to some use? You're not just trying to block IPs and carry on with the day job. How are you going to become more proactive? How's your organization going to become more resilient? And then finally, underneath, cyber threat intelligence. I think it's now part of ISO 27001, some sort of cyber threat intelligence function, because it's recognised as a really important part of becoming more proactive in the arms race against cyber threats. Then when it all goes wrong, some sort of team, your instant response team, that can spring into action and help your organisation recover as soon as possible. And this is what going back before about attribution. Attribution shouldn't matter in this area. This should be about getting your business operational as quickly as possible. If you want to go on the attribution route or some sort of investigation, then that should come afterwards. priority is about getting your organisation up and running without compromising any evidence that might lead the investigation. So going forwards, it's really straightforward when you put it onto you know, little pretty slides like this. But it's incredible how often or how easy it is to forget. Doing things in a structured way allows your organisation to become much more secure and to track the development and maturity of that security. So where are you trying to get to? What is your organisational strategy? Are you trying to grow to 1,000 people, or are you trying to get some investment? That will all determine how you approach your security program. Who in your organisation is going to be responsible for it? Do you have a chief? Do you have to outsource it? How are you going to define your baseline? Is it going to be a checkbox exercise? Are you going to look at something like 27001? Just pick something. Doesn't matter what it is. Pick something like that internationally recognised, and then understand what you've got and where are the gaps, and then making sure that you consider those 4 areas whenever you're looking to implement your security controls. And then finally, some eagles fighting. Why not? That's it, guys. Any questions on any of that? Yeah. So this is a model on our incident response team. So when whenever we get an attack, what we found helpful, and this applies to internal teams as well, is almost keep the leadership team abreast of the situation, but not allowing them to interfere directly in the incident response. So what we're trying to do is have an engagement manager who can translate. Right. So what we're trying to do is the engagement manager is enabling the flow of information from the incident management team to the victim team, but the leadership team, the board, whoever's in charge of the organisation, giving them enough information to allow them to make risk-based decisions on how they proceed with the investigation. So, in a ransomware attack, for example, you'd be talking to them about how likely do you think it is that the attackers have exfiltrated data? How much can you see in the log data that says whether they have or haven't? And allowing that team to make an informed decision around how they proceed. Are they going to speak to a PR company? How are they going to communicate with the media? But that engagement manager role is key because it allows the incident manager to focus on the tech, to focus on the investigation, to keep the technical guys working hard to identify where the threat comes from and get the answers to those questions that the leadership team are going to ask. Without that engagement manager, the leadership team inevitably end up speaking to the incident manager, and he ends up in all the meetings and all of his time taken up with doing that liaison role. In our experience, anyway.
Just relating into that, so a lot of the companies in the One Nucleus network are maybe at the smaller end of the scale, so they perhaps don't have kind of the in-house capability. But is there, if there isn't that in-house structure or personnel, what would be, and maybe outsourcing is expensive, what is the best next possible solution? I
think insurance, or most of the insurance I've seen will come with that team. I was talking to James before. We do a load of like tabletop exercise with a group of cluster of law firms in the southeast, and what's been really helpful is they've brought their insurance provider to those tabletop exercises. So while we've been going through the scenario, while we've been escalating the severity of the scenario, they've been able to turn to the insurance provider and say, well, what will you do? How are you going to help us with this? And that's been great for the guys to get confidence that their insurance provider will provide the right service at the right time. And a lot of it goes around this expertise. The engagement manager can be somebody from within your organisation. It doesn't need to be anyone specialist. It can be whoever's in your organisation responsible for comms. It could be your MD. You know, if you're small, then you necessarily need to compress all this. So I think it's important that you consider this, and whatever size of organisation you are, you should have an incident response plan, and that plan should dictate what this looks like. This is obviously best case scenario. This is, you know, for what we provide as a business and what bigger companies are able to provide internally and what insurance firms will provide. But your incident response plan needs to have an appropriate level of control for your organisation, depending on what size you are.
I've got a
healthcare professionals that you spoke about and having to restore all their data. So what are the measures? So presumably they come into the category of quite a small organisation.
Which one? Sorry, I missed that.
So on one of the slides on the case study, the third case study.
Yeah.
This health service provider. Yeah. So presumably they were quite small, or was this a larger organisation?
No, they were in the hundreds.
Okay. I got the impression that they was quite small, as in the respect that sort of like. So what are the measures? Did you then work? So once you had protected the, you know, or brought back their data, you know, restored all of their machines and done all the sheep dipping, so to speak. What are the measures? Did you then work with them to put all the measures in place to help protect them? And what were those measures?
So we worked them insofar as they want to pay us. So we helped them to get to a point where we found the key criticality, the key critical vulnerabilities that they needed to remediate. So one was around USB sticks. We think that the attack was probably USB initiated in some way. The other was around logging and the ability to maintain evidence when this sort of thing happens. So because it was an NHS provider, they've got that sort of separation between their network, the NHS network, and something else. The NHS network, because it was run by BT, didn't collect any logs around that organisation. They outsourced the firewall to a third-party provider who only kept logs for a couple of minutes for some reason. I don't know why anybody. Anyway, that we had a good argument with them. So the organisation itself wasn't really. It wasn't that badly protected because it was hidden behind this NHS thing. So the only way the attacker could have got in was, we think, was by a USB stick, or this laptop might have got in somehow. So the things that we recommended was keeping the backups somewhere more local so they could restore quicker, segregating the network into smaller segments, and more logging and more effective sort of. I think they were a Windows organisation. They built a Linux server to keep all the logs on. If they did get ransomware, then the Linux server wouldn't get attacked. The Windows systems would. From memory. Dig out
though. You just mentioned PC environment there. We're a mixed environment, so we have Macs and PCs. Does that create a more complex level of security, or don't worry about it?
No, it does create a more complex environment because there's more things to update, there's more things to manage, and there's more variation of things to manage. And not all so for example, CrowdStrike endpoint detection is really good on Microsoft endpoints. On a Mac, it's a pain because you've got to install it with local admin privileges. So the way security products work means that if you've got a really mixed economy of operating systems, it just becomes a bit more complicated to manage. It's not impossible. I wouldn't say a significant risk. I'd just say it's something that needs to be carefully managed and appreciated as part of any security program. It's from my point of view, it's better to have a harmonized set of IT because you can update them in the same way, you can manage them in the same way. But at the same time, that means that they're all equally vulnerable. So, but we went Macs years ago and stayed with we got rid of all of our Microsoft endpoints anyway.
I've got a quick question.
Yep.
Yeah. For smaller organizations where perhaps we don't have larger teams and sort of being able to have dedicated teams of security, I suppose one question I have is there some kind of industry standard framework from which you can essentially make a call as to where you are and then step by step work your way towards being essentially as secure as you can be? Is there anything of the sort?
Yeah, so 10 steps cybersecurity is a great set of instructions, and if you couple this with Cyber Essentials as a framework or as an accreditation, then they get you to a really good standard for a small business. I think there's even a small business version of the 10 steps. So I think following something like that and getting a bit of advice as and when you need it from your IT provider or anyone who's got that level of knowledge in your organisation is probably a good step. But there's tons of guidance on the NCSC website. They've really done well in making sure that the UK economy for all scale is catered for with their advice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you. Okay, so moving on to our final presentation. So delighted to welcome firstly Oliver Kidd, partner at Pennington Manchester Cooper. Oliver is a commercial lawyer providing guidance to businesses on a variety of commercial contracts with a particular focus on IT, technology and procurement. Oliver is recommended in the Legal 500 as a rising star and regularly participates in seminars, client training sessions and various sector-focused events. Oliver is joined by his colleague Charlotte Hill, who's Senior Associate at Pennington Manchester Cooper. So Charlotte also has the accolade Rising Star in the Legal 500 on 4 occasions during 2021 and 2022. She advises on a broad range of complex, high-value, cross-border disputes across a number of commercial and business sectors and has specialist expertise in digital assets, where she advises clients about cryptocurrencies and blockchain disputes. So I'm delighted to welcome you up. Thank you both.
Hi,
everybody. Yeah, we've already been introduced, but just to say, we're from Pennington Manchester Cooper, which is a law firm focusing on life sciences and technology in particular. And consistent with the theme of today, Charlotte and I are actually in different practice areas, but I think cybersecurity, more than most other areas, kind of draws together different specialisms. So I'm more on the contract side and Charlotte's more on the disputes. So we'll begin with a brief look at the cyber threat journey.
So I think with that in mind, I just wanted to really highlight from a legal perspective where we come from at this angle. A lot of what's already been said is in our presentation, so we'll try and skip through that to the extent we can, mindful of time. But really just to show that this is a 360 journey, which is what I hope this diagram does. And it starts with, as we've heard really helpfully this afternoon, prevention. Prevention is, as they say, better than cure. And there's a lot that can be done in advance to try to avoid and to mitigate the risks of a cyber attack. And as we've already heard, we can't eradicate them in totality, but there are many steps that can be done. So we'll briefly discuss a few of those, particularly from a legal perspective today. There's the action, which, as we've heard today, is incident response, and that's where typically my team, we tend to get involved as and when things start to go wrong, as and when you suspect the system's been infiltrated or there's a slight issue going on. As we'll come on to, the first step really in our advice to our clients is to contact lawyers, and again, for reasons that we'll explain, to then get the other parties involved as and when. Once we finally manage as a team to work together collaboratively to get the business back up and running and to try to restore any reputational damage that may have been caused, that isn't the end of the road. We don't stop there. There's actually this remediation step, which aside from potentially pursuing the bad actors, which depending on the type of attack can be possible, there's other steps to take to make sure that we can protect any further issues going forward, deal with the ongoing data health checks, and then start back at the beginning. So it is a real life cycle here that, as we've heard already, should keep going around and around, and hopefully if that first segment's in place, you may never have to get to that middle one.
Yeah, and before we launch into the legal landscape, we thought it'd be useful to look at some statistics, and it's quite reassuring that we're all, singing from the same hymn sheet, and businesses and organisations are taking cybersecurity seriously now, and the stats really do back that up. So there is the big 39% stat which we've covered already. And just digging down into that a little further in terms of the frequency of cyber attacks, a quarter of those reporting are attacked at least weekly. The most common attack is phishing. 83% of reported attacks are phishing attacks. And as we've already discussed today, individuals are often seen as the weakest link in organisations when it comes to cybersecurity, so that's no surprise that phishing is the most common. In terms of the consequences of attacks, 1 in 5 are reporting to have lost money, data, or other assets. And yeah, some further data from the National Cybersecurity Centre. Effectively they've been responding to a lot of cybersecurity incidents, and these are the stats to kind of put cybersecurity higher up the agenda of organisations. And onto the legal framework in the UK. I think the most important point to make is that there's no single cybersecurity law in the UK. It's very much a patchwork of data protection, national security, criminal law, and it's all kind of pieced together. So it's different in other jurisdictions, but here we don't have a single cybersecurity law. And here are some of the laws that we're often looking into from a cyber perspective. Obviously, data protection laws, the Network and Information Systems Regulations, which we'll come on to, the Computer Misuse Act. Obviously, it's an old act now, but it's still relevant in terms of computer crimes. Similarly, Communications Act. And also, when you're looking at the legal landscape, it's important to look at sector-specific rules and regimes. We have a lot of clients in the financial services sector, and they're subject to specific, more stringent rules. So just looking at data protection regime. So this is when we're dealing with the protection of personal data. So the Data Protection Act and the UK GDPR requires organisations to ensure appropriate security of personal data, including protection against unauthorised or unlawful processing. So that's really a direct cybersecurity responsibility in respect of personal data. And the NIS regulations, which I think they go on to
next one.
Next. Yeah, so this is just taking it a step further. It's a specific piece of legislation, and it's aimed at protecting the reliability and security of essential services. So it's effectively services which are needed for the country to operate effectively. So I only really mention this in passing because we've been through exercises with clients of effectively finding out whether they are subject to these regulations. If they are, then there's a specific cybersecurity regime over and above the standard ones that I mentioned previously, which would apply. So they apply to operators of essential services, and the key sectors are energy, transport, health, drinking water, and digital infrastructure, and it's those that are relying on network and IT systems. There are specific thresholds, so it's really focused on the larger organisations. And similarly, for relevant digital service providers, there's a specific set of criteria that if they are met, then these rules apply. And in terms of whether an organisation is caught, if it is, then a specific regime applies, and that would include minimum security standards to protect systems and timely reporting of incidents. So for that, it's just a case of finding out whether you're caught, and if so, understanding the law.
So dealing now with what happens when you are alerted to the fact something has gone wrong. As you've already heard, you ought to be having in place, irrespective, I think, of the size of your business, policies and procedures. I say that not least because that means as directors and those managing a business, you're more likely then to avoid any potential liability if you've already thought this through in advance, because by doing so, you are then protecting your company that you are dealing with, and you are giving them the best chance of success. So I think that's really important to bear in mind, particularly as those managing companies may well have their own personal liability if they're not doing what's been advised, including things like this. Following a policy then makes it actually much simpler if you've already thought it through, if you've already tested what's going to happen. But what you ought to do first and foremost, contact your own internal IT system and IT people. As we were saying, Keith earlier, you know straight away what to be looking at. So we had one client, for example, that didn't notify their IT team. I think they probably skipped to the next step, which you think may well help, but it turned out they had then forgotten to change passwords, something really simple, but it meant because then the password had already been obtained, then the bad actor could stay in the systems, and we couldn't shut them out as quickly as possible. So things like that are really important to make sure you do. We then have quite a specific order as to the way in which, when you then get external companies involved, and even for the most largest multinationals, 9 times out of 10 they will get external companies involved. That's perfectly normal. And as we're saying, particularly for those SMEs or even the smaller startups, if you've got insurance, then they ought to be covering a large part of this, and obviously can review the policies to check that is the case. But first and foremost, you should be instructing lawyers. And the reason we say that is not because we're lawyers, but is because of the fact that then we can try to maintain privilege over the subsequent communications. And that's important for the fact that we can then try to preserve the internal dialogue that's been going on. No doubt the risk blaming, the finger pointing, and everything else that you don't want getting out there into the public domain for a whole variety of reasons. And without lawyers involved, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to have privilege. And so that's why we say instruct us first and foremost. We then as a team then tend to coordinate the instruction of others. And so we will then know, not only will your policy tell you probably who to go to next, but we will then know who you've already selected, who we contact, how we deal with them, and we can then coordinate that for you. And at that point, then we would then, assuming there is insurance in place, contact the insurers, because the insurers will have a very clear policy as to how it needs to be dealt with. And you, as a policy holder, if indeed you are, will want to make sure that you are complying with that, so then policy isn't avoided and cover is provided. So you contact insurers, they may then have their own incident response team they want you to deal with. We can coordinate that. And then that's when you then kind of gear up the breach response cybersecurity team. And at that point, we all then tend to divide up. So we'll have the negotiators will go off dealing with, for example, the ransom demands. We will have people going off to speak to the regulators, people going to report to the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, if and when data's been stolen or a risk of it, to make sure that those people are dealing with the right people at the right time and actually saying the right things. Because when you get to know these bodies and these individuals, you know the way to communicate it to try to mitigate the risk as much as possible. So I do think it's very important to have people that are experts in this area on hand, on standby, and as we've already heard, knowing the number, even if it is your post-it note, who to call just to start that process going. Of course, once you've done that, it is important to make those communications. You know, you need to be letting people know what's gone on. The stakeholders, you know, those managing the business need to know to be able to sign off on the decisions that are being made. And also you need to remember there are potentially other affected parties, and depending on what's gone on, it might be that data's been stolen. And if that's personal data, then we've got some serious issues, and you may well need to be making notifications, not just to the ICO, but also to those individuals whose data may or may not have been stolen. And we had that. There's been quite a few, it was over the last summer, I think, particularly sets of barristers' chambers that in the space of a few short months had all been hacked. And I actually had a call from the barrister saying some of my clients' data was a part of that hack. But it's the first thing they have to do. You know, they've obviously reported it a couple of hours ago. They actually went and got a freezing order, which we'll come on to briefly. But then they're making disclosures to everybody whose potential data has been stolen, and so you can do what you want to protect yourself. So that's a really important task, and quite often something that people tend to forget. I think you think once you've started making the reports, that's the end of the road, but unfortunately it's not. And again, that just goes back to why really you need that team around you, because as a business, you naturally aren't going to have the bandwidth for all of this at the same time, and that's why we have teams to deal with this. And then the last one there is that reporting, and as I say, that's reporting to what the insurer is engaged, but to the regulators, to the ICO, and to other key stakeholders. So lots going on in a very short space of time, and as we say, more often than not, we tend to find them to be late on a Friday, over the weekend, and as we say, bank holiday weekends typically as well. Ransomware, as we've already heard, is one of the key trends that's been taking place over the last couple of years. That's still, I think, we're certainly seeing still very prevalent and still one of the most common attacks that we are seeing. You'll see here I'm saying it's a double threat. The reason why it's a double threat is because they hit you, they then know that you've got a weakened system, and they are likely to come back for more very quickly if they can. So even if you pay them off straight away, which we'll come on to, doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of the road. And that's the reason why a lot of these attacks aren't reported in the public domain, simply because companies don't want others to know, apart from the bad press, of course, that there is a fault in the system and that they've got this weakness. Because of the demands, of course, it leads to this increased pressure on these organisations who may initially, I think quite commonly, refuse to pay a ransom. You say absolutely not. That's, you know, that's illegal. We're not going to be paying it. But quite often, depending on what the insurance position is, particularly, people do end up paying up simply because they want to re-access the data and they want to get the business back up and running. So what can you do? There's a case law here, AA versus Persons Unknown, which actually relates to, well, it's quite instrumental for various reasons, but it relates to a Canadian insurer that was hacked back in 2019. Its insurer in turn was an English insurer, which is why we had the case law here in the High Courts in London. But they ended up paying a ransom demand. I think it was, from memory, it's about 109 Bitcoin, which I think at the time was about 500-600K. But what the insurer had then twigged, they then got legal advice themselves. This is the English insurer. They put a tracer on the Bitcoin before the ransom demand was paid. And so they knew exactly which wallet it had gone into. And so suddenly the legal team, which was a separate legal team dealing with now the recoveries of this Bitcoin and this ransom demand, went off and froze the Bitcoin. And it was the first freezing order that the High Court made about cryptocurrency, and granted a proprietary injunction as well, which meant that in turn, eventually, the English insurer could then recover the Bitcoin that it paid as ransom. So just because you paid a ransom demand, if indeed you have, doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of the road, and you can still pursue the bad actors in certain ways using the English legal system to try to recover at least some of your assets, if not all of them. And I think from memory, they recovered about the value of 86 Bitcoin, so they managed to get a very good percentage of it. I won't talk too much about the criminal issues, but there are many criminal issues that could also arise from this. Paying a ransom demand isn't illegal. Of course, making one is. It's a bribe. And paying it isn't illegal, but there are various criminal hurdles that you need to consider. And this is why, particularly from a criminal perspective, taking advice is key. I mean, of course, the obvious one, money laundering issues, you may well fall foul of those, and terrorist financing if you're making a payment. I mean, OFAC have sanctioned various different tumblers that are using crypto now that are being used in order for you to pay the ransom demand. So you want to make sure you're not falling foul of those. That obviously comes into the sanctions territory. And then again, data protection, for the simple fact that if your data has been stolen, contains somebody's personal information, there are various criminal sanctions there as well as civil. So again, all very important reasons why you ought to be taking advice at the earliest stage. So as I say, that isn't the end of the road. If and when you've dealt with the incident, you've managed to perhaps recover your data, or you've managed to unlock the systems and get them back up and running, there are other avenues. And this is where my team, we try to remind our clients at the end of it, of course, you've just had an absolute nightmare couple of weeks. It's cost a hell of a lot of money, time, effort, as well as all the sort of damage to the reputation and the business itself. But that isn't the end of the road, as I say. We can trace ransom payments that had made as per that judgment back in 2019. You can pursue the bad actors. I mean, I agree quite often they might well be in some far off jurisdiction where you're not going to get there, but that's not always the case. So it's worth looking into, not least again, because actually if as a director, there was a potential pot of money there that you could seek to recover and you haven't looked into it, you alone as a director could then be on the hook if you're aware of that and haven't taken any steps to at least make some preliminary inquiries. And then there could well be other claims. You have suffered damage and loss as a result of this. Has a company negligently advised you about whatever it is that's somehow gone wrong? Has that third-party supplier, for example, have they let somebody into their systems into your system via their software, things like that. So, you may well be able to pursue others, and particularly other insurers in the background if and when things have gone wrong. So don't just close that book there. Do what you can, and no doubt your stakeholders will then be will be much happier. I was going to say very impressed. It's probably the wrong phrase, but be much happier by the fact they know that you are trying to recoup some of those business losses, while of course getting the business back up and running.
Yeah, so given the increasing threat and likelihood of cyber attacks, we're summarising here the practical steps that organisations can take to make sure that they're in the best possible position to respond to these. One of the benefits of speaking last today is that a lot of these have already been covered. And some of these, as lawyers, we can help out with. Others are for some of the other speakers to advise and help with. So the first point has already been made a couple of times: technical audits. Before you get into putting in place cybersecurity measures, it's really important to understand what data you have, your hardware, your devices, and your systems. So once you know where you stand, then you can progress your cybersecurity journey to the next stage. Reviewing your supply chain, this is probably more in our wheelhouse in terms of looking at contracts with suppliers. Who are your key suppliers? What contractual obligations do they have in terms of cybersecurity, and what rights do you have against them? And we've been involved with various exercises of reviewing supply chains, spotting that a particular supplier hasn't really done much around cybersecurity, so we've kind of put contractual obligations on them to do that, and pitch the liability and indemnity clauses accordingly, really just to strengthen the supply chain, because you're only as strong as your weakest link, really. In terms of other areas we've been involved with, specific cybersecurity and resilience policies and processes, as others have mentioned, it's important to establish an incident management team with clear roles and responsibilities, and having that practical response plan that everybody can turn to as and when an attack occurs to mitigate damage and minimize business interruption. Testing, others have talked about this, testing your systems and processes and addressing vulnerabilities. Penetration testing in particular is good because it's far better to simulate an attack and identify those vulnerabilities so that they can be addressed, rather than kind of deal with the consequences of a real attack. Training, again, staff are often seen as the weakest link from a cybersecurity perspective, so it's important that everybody within an organisation understands security obligations and can spot the warning signs of cybercrime. Insurance, obviously Matthew's covered this in detail, and we've said initially review your current insurance coverage to see whether traditional insurance might cover cyber risks, but spoiler alert, as Matthew's already covered it, it won't do. So consider whether specific cyber insurance is needed, because we're seeing that those traditional policies aren't covering cyber risks. And other work that we've been involved with, reviewing contracts and policies, making those amendments to mitigate risks. Conducting DD on suppliers. You know, a security conscious organisation shouldn't be forming partnerships with suppliers, particularly where they have access to key data, if those suppliers aren't reputable and aren't taking cybersecurity seriously. So we're often seeing as a contractual obligation that you know, suppliers have to have been through Cyber Essentials or be ISO accredited. So consider weaving that into the onboarding process of suppliers. I think this kind of covers some of the previous points, but from a personal data perspective, you know, that there is a specific regime around personal data. So again, understand data flows, hosting arrangements of personal data, and your regulatory obligations, because if there is an attack that results in a data breach, then you would be under a duty to report that to the ICO.
I think we just wanted to end bang on 6 o'clock, actually, just with a few key takeaway points, just to illustrate the point and labour it probably for the 100th time today. But it was only reported, I think it was last week, Hackney Borough Council suffered a cyber attack back in October 2020, and it cost the council in total, as you see there, £12.2 million just in the last financial year alone. And actually, when you look at that, over £1 million there was due to the costs involved in dealing with the incident, which I think for a local council is quite a staggering sum. And I think that only goes to the points we've already been made at length about insurance and why ideally that would help to the extent you can get it. I think adopting the best practice processes is always the way forward. It's hard. We have had, Ollie and I have advised before clients where they have suffered an attack and it turns out they'd received it in a year before a report showing all the different vulnerabilities in their systems and just thought, I can't deal with this, it's too much. I'm a recent startup. It's just not my bag right now. Thank you very much. I'll look at that another time. And lo and behold, somebody's attacked them. And we had to say to the directors, go and get independent legal advice. You are likely to be on the hook now. You knew this was a risk and now the company has suffered losses. And so to the extent you as a business can do anything to encourage best practice, to dictate in the policies what your staff, your employees must do, and to make sure you are adhering to the best practices, I think is going to help a long way with not just that, but also with getting any future insurance cover. As we say, prevention is better than cure. So is there anything else you can do? I agree, it's a cyclical thing. I think you need to keep that under constant review. And sadly, these criminals are very intelligent and they are keeping abreast of all the developments and trying to stay one step ahead, or often 2 or 3 steps ahead. So it's not something we can rest on our laurels once we think we've got that security in place, unfortunately. Make sure you know, I think first and foremost as a business, who is in charge of doing what when things go wrong. As I say, hopefully that won't happen, but if and when it does, it's pandemonium. And just to know what you need to do and follow it step by step is really key, and will no doubt lead to a much more efficient response team. So I think that's very key. And to the extent if there's any other international players, consider that. But again, your team will advise you of that as and when that's needed. So there we are. We are now 3 minutes over, but we're happy to take any questions if anyone has any. We're also going to the pub if you have any there.
Sorry, we could wait.
No, I'm joking.
So it's just about the ICO in terms of, say, for a small organisation such as One Nucleus Network, at what point would you need to inform the ICO, and what point at the criteria that needs to be met for such notification?
Straight away. Once you've kind of followed the first few processes I outlined, which is getting your lawyers and the incident response team up and running, you need to determine what's gone on. There's a short, I can't remember the time period, there's a very short time window in which you need to be making that notification. And that's exactly what your advisors will be able to tell you. Yes, it is, yeah. And that's where I think the legal team come in, those who deal with the ICO regularly, to know the way to communicate the breach, to the extent of it. And obviously you need to ideally know a bit about what's gone on in advance so that you can make that report to the ICO in a way which suddenly isn't going to tip them off to the point they come running in full force, if that's at all possible. But I mean, the ICO is a tricky one, but they are there, and they are the full regulator that you certainly don't want to upset, not least for the fact they can fine you. I think it's up to the greater of 17.5 million, or I think it's 4% of your annual turnover. So they have some very large penalties if you don't comply. That being said, one of the reasons why, in fact, this client that I was talking about that decided not to, that didn't fix the problems with their systems and then had a second attack, they also decided not to notify the ICO. And one of the reasons why they chose not to was because when you look at how many fines have been made, they are very small number of fines and very insubstantial sums in comparison to what they could have been. But that's not to say they're going to stick to that. I think at the moment they're still dealing with a lot of data thefts and trying to process it, but I think they're going to be tighter on enforcement going forward. So I would 100% always be recommending to follow that to the letter. Wherever the lawyers are coming from, whether it's from the insurance side or your own side, they will be the ones dealing with the notifications and make sure you're following that, yes. Yeah.
Sorry, then just following on about the criteria, that in when you would need to, what criteria do you have to meet for notification for them?
There's a whole sort of list as to what it is, but basically if it's going to be the personal data in particular, that's the time when you need to be making the reports. But it's not, sadly, there's not 2 or 3 bullet points that you can either say straight away if you're in or out, if you've got anything.
It's a case by case basis, I think. But I can't. Yeah, it depends.
Any questions?
What advice would you give to really small organisations trying to build value in the R&D phase, not lots of revenue, in terms of how they should approach insurance, legal advice? Because the founder of the organisation will have their eye on their exit in 3 to 5 years' time, and any cost against that ambition is judged badly.
I think we're seeing cybersecurity as giving credibility to businesses as well, really. So, you know, if this is taken seriously, then, you know, your business will be taken seriously. So I think it's kind of, it's moving away from like the risk of ICO fines, because we're not really seeing that, to more look how secure our organisation is. Yes, you want to invest in us. Yes, you want to do business with us. So we're seeing it move up the agenda from a credibility perspective, I think.
Yeah, and I think ultimately there are ways that you can scale this. You know, you don't have to start at the or singing or dancing security piece at the end, albeit of course that would be the dream. And equally, you don't need to have a full team that you've necessarily briefed that have been in and audited your whole system. But I think if you can start where you at least know who it is you're going to get involved if and when things go wrong, and start, you know, just doing some small DD parts and kind of the audits in the background, then as you progress up and up, obviously, as long as you keep that under review, you know, if you can then ramp it up as you go, I think that's sensible. And I think ultimately, as I don't want to keep harping on about it, but I've had so many clients where the directors don't understand their own potential personal liability. And so if they don't listen voluntarily and understand the long-term goal, because perhaps they are going to be heading out, they need to understand that they could still well be on the hook depending on their insurance policy and when the claim's made. And so ultimately it's in everybody's interest to make sure you're doing what you ought to at the right time rather than sadly too late.
Okay, thank you. Unless there are any online questions, I suggest we wrap this up. Looking at the chair.
Thank you very much to all of those comments.
with that, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers today. So thank you firstly to Keith, Matthew, Dave, and then Oliver and Charlotte. So we are having a drink at the pub, so to those who can make it and join us, if we all sort of stay together, maybe we can go over together. James has agreed to lead. But this has been a really fascinating session. As James said at the beginning, it's one we hope to gain momentum and keep going, and as part of One Nucleus's innovation support, the Business Resilience thematic group. So I do hope that we will be reconvening in the future, probably next year at this rate, and that you can all join us again, and that we can keep growing the group and sharing tips, best practices to support organisations in our ecosystem. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending in person and online. It still takes me by shock when a voice comes out of the wall, but yeah, so thanks to everyone, and yeah, hope you can stay and join us for some networking. Thank you all.